Well, this is a long time coming, this book, and so I want to thank Jaime and Rose and Ferrante and other people here who have organized this book launching. This is our 5th book event. The book came out last fall, and it is already being used in Asian American Studies and college course on social movements at the University of Washington. We have held 2 events in the Philippines. One that was over 100 people at the University of the Philippines, another that was almost 200 people, hosted by Akbayan youth and ASEAN youth. And their education, they were so excited about the book that their educational forums that they're holding is now entitled A Time to Rise, after the name of our book. They're very inspired by the lessons and wanting to know more about the U.S. Filipino communities and our work in that community. And we've also had 2 launchings in Seattle, this one, and then we will be holding our launch in San Francisco as part of the Association of Asian American Studies at the end of this month. And so, and overall the book is selling well, and people are very excited, and we've had a very warm reception and people congratulating us in a project that took over 20 years to do. And many of you were part of this collective effort. And many times we thought that we would not be able to finish this project. But we kept at it. The editors changed every once in a while as people kind of had other things to do, lost hope, but there was we knew that eventually this book would be published. And obviously, collective effort is always difficult to accomplish. Even though the relationships in the KDP changed over the years, we still pursue this collective effort. And our original vision about this book and why it was important never changed. We knew that our history was an important part of the U.S. history, an important part of the radical movements in this country, especially because at that time we were the only radical Filipino organization, and we had accomplished some very significant victories and significant experiences that needed to be shared. And we thought it was important that we write this history while we were still alive and while we could still remember many of the experiences and the campaigns. Some of us were a little bit younger, tad bit younger. Some of us had better memories and could remember, with very much clarity, our work that we had accomplished. And it's important that we write this history. Oftentimes history is written by white males who have nothing to do with our history other than writing our history. And so this book is important because these are our stories, this is our history, and we wrote this history. And we made sure that our political analysis was in the center of this book, and our own personal histories as young people, because we were once young, was a part of this. And it's from our lens and from our own words that this history is told. We also knew it was important to impart the lessons that we learned. Unfortunately, we didn't realize that we were going to get old, and we didn't take the steps to pass on our organization and our work to the next generation. So, we didn't build the next generation of cadre. And what we leave in this book is our lessons, our victories and defeats and experiences. As Rose said, our analysis to the work was important. Our summations of the work were very scientific. Our Marxist analysis, we have no shame that was included in all of our work, and our method of analysis. And it's important that we share those experiences and our victories and our defeats and our summations because of what we faced both in this country and what we face in the Philippines, which Bruce and Rene are going to speak about. And you know, it's important that we identified as the left here in the United States, especially given the state of the left in the United States. We have no shame in claiming that history. And you know, we were a little bit more than anti-imperialists. We believed in socialism in this country. And so as the term socialism kind of seated in the background years ago, it's come to the forefront again in terms of what is a viable option instead of US imperialism or imperialism of other countries. We need to look at socialism even with all its warts and difficulties. And so, you know, we felt that in those years, we provided, as part of the left, direction and grounding and ability to sustain our movement because of that analysis and commitment to building our movements here in this country. And what is obvious from our events in the Philippines is that people in the Philippines are very interested in this work and emphasizing the transnational movement that we always talked about. And the young people who hosted us last month in the Philippines, you know, unfortunately, the cost of the book is relative to the Philippine cost is exorbitant. But we have received actually 2 offers to publish our book in the Philippines because they know that there is great demand of learning about US Filipino communities and the organizing historically that has happened, and currently a discussion of current organizing, especially given what's happening in both our countries. There's a commonality in terms of the rise of fascism in both countries. And so, you know, it's, you know, we didn't know that when the book was published that we would be in these difficult times in both countries. And so the juncture in which this book comes out is very important for both countries. As you know, if you look at the book was not meant to be a definitive history of the KDP with all its theoretical constructs, with our struggles with the left in the Philippines, or even a very clear analysis, political analysis of our work and our analysis of the US-based Filipino community. And so the book, and we didn't feel that we could do that over the last 20 years. And that is for someone else to do, hopefully someone who had been in the organization to do, so again, that we write our own history. The book is 42 stories, personal stories that were written, mostly begun in writing retreats, and some of the stories were based off of what people wanted to write. I think the only guideline that we had was that you couldn't attack the KDP leadership. Use it as a way to get even on criticisms here, right? But we were very open. You know, obviously people had difficulties, personal difficulties, family difficulties, difficulties with transferring. You know, KDP was known to transfer people all over the country based on what the needs of the work were. And people talked about in their stories. The foreword is by Professor Augusto Espiritu. Rene Cruz, as one of the leaders in the KDP, wrote the introduction. And there are 4 main chapters in the book. The first, and we didn't have these all divided when we said you can write the stories, but it turned out there were like 4 categories to the book. In which the first section is about the beginnings and how people got involved in the movement and came to the KDP. And so being Filipino national, being a mix of Filipino nationals, Filipino-Americans, a broad range of ages, people came to the organization through different work, through different people, And so that's the beginnings, and there are like 10 stories in that section. The next section is called In the Thick of the Struggle, and that is a section about concrete work that people were doing and their personal stories about being in the work. And sometimes it's a story that's a moment or spans a number of years. Estella Habal's story spans a number of years and goes through both political and personal tribulations. And so that's, if you want to know about the KDP work, that's the section that talks about various campaigns and work that the organization did. The next section, the Testifier, and that is the stories, collections of stories about the murders of Silme Domingo, my brother, and Gene Viernes, and the struggle which lasted over 10 years to hold the Marcos dictatorship and the US government accountable for those murders. I remember Bruce Occena came up to Seattle to help us write those stories, and we went away to an island retreat, and it was the first time that people had taken a step back to recollect in their memories what had happened. And one of the stories is from David Della, who came to the Union right after the murders. And it was the first time he had to recount on paper his memories of being asked to identify Gene Viernes' body on June 1st, 1981. And so the stories in that section are particularly moving, but also gives you a sense of the struggle and the fight that comrades took during those 10 years to get justice for Silme and Gene. And then the last section of stories is looking back, and that is a combination of people, children of KDP activists who wrote the stories a little while ago, but it's the child's perspective on their parents' work and what it meant to them. And I think some of the parents whose stories, the children's stories, they were afraid of what their children were going to say in those stories because they never had that discussion about what do you think about our work and the sacrifices of being put in childcare all those years. And then there are other stories about my favorite story. Actually, one of my favorite stories in the whole book is written by Edwin Batumbaco, who talks about, was it all worth it? I mean, many of us asked that question after the organizations had fallen apart. Was all the sacrifices we made, both personal and politically, was it all worth it? And so that's, in hindsight, looking at that. And then there is a particular document. We used to have a theoretical bulletin called Ang Activista, the activist, and it's called the Ang Activista Orientation to Philippine Support Work. That was written in 1983, and it's a significant document because we had some we had serious and deep disagreements with the left in the Philippines, and this document goes through a period of time after the Benigno Aquino assassination, when political conditions had greatly changed in terms of the broadness of the movement, and looking at the KDP's analysis, and was one of the key documents that led to the split with the left in the Philippines. And we thought that that was an important document that was penned by Rene, Cruz, and other members of the leadership there. And then a timeline of the KDP that was written by Helen Toribio, who passed away a few years ago. There are, as I said, there are 42 stories, 15 by men, and 27 written by women, which speaks to the leadership of women in the KDP. Women were very strong in the KDP. If any of you were familiar with the KDP, women were in the leadership, they led, and so, and they led on very important struggles in the organization. Now, because this book took it took about 21, 22 years. I always actually measure it by how old my nephew is. He's 21 now, so it's a little bit over 21 years old. And at some point, we decided to move forward with the publishing, and the University of Washington was always interested in our book. They realized the significance of the book. There were many professors there that understood the significance of the book to the movement and to history. But we have to acknowledge there are many stories that remained unfinished. Some stories were started, some were written, but never edited. And in the end, we actually had too many stories. And so comrades in LA said, well, what happens if somebody says, how come there are no LA stories? We were gonna blame it on certain people because they were editors at that time. And people say, well, there might be a book 2. And I said, oh Lord. If this one took us 21 years, book 2 will take us even longer. So there are many stories unfinished. We hope that eventually they'll be edited and we'll have a website and they can maybe even be read more broadly. But there are also many campaigns that were not covered because we didn't have the people to write them. You know, this was a voluntary effort over the years. And so, but we're very pleased at how it turned out. And I think what you'll find is that the book is very moving. I remember, you would think after 21 years I would be tired of it, but when I had to read it for its final editing, I was very moved by the stories and how it all came together, especially given the overview that Rene Cruz had provided for the organization. And that they're very personal stories, accounts of people who spent really their best years, young years of their life building a movement and fighting a dictatorship and trying to build socialism here in the United States. Some of our comrades have passed on. We lost 2 comrades in January, back to back. And one of them, Esther Simpson, was so important to the work that was done with nurses in this country. So we remember her for that work. But we remember that we were young, and many of us are still doing political work, trying to work for the ideals that we started so long ago. And so some of us continue that work, and many of us who were in the KDP are still living by those ideals and principles. So I hope you'll buy the book, because I don't want to have to carry them all back to Seattle. And we only have limited copies, so I hope after the program you'll buy the book. It really is a wonderful book. But it did impact our work, you know, the regionalism. So, for example, in the murders of Silme Domingo and Gene Viernes, within the Union, the most conservative elements in the Union were Ilocanos. They were the upper echelon of the Union. They were the foremen. They were the president of the Union. And therefore, they had their regional brotherhood. And they marched in line, in essence, to support the corruption, to participate in the corruption of the Union. So, I mean, those were the elements of our analysis in terms of who was who in the community. You know, what were the balance of forces? Where was the power held? Those were all elements of our analysis. You know, I think this section of the book on the murders of Silme Domingo and Gene Viernes brings all of the strengths of the KDP together. I mean, obviously, we knew we were up against a powerful enemy, the Marcos dictatorship, and the support of the US to that dictatorship. But we were all stunned when Silme and Gene's murders happened. But our analysis and our positioning in that community over the years brought the analysis of who was responsible for those murders very quickly. And really, within a 48-hour period, we analyzed who benefited from those murders. It was already a natural analysis that we would begin to look, even in spite of our grief, in spite of being stunned, we were not immobilized. We knew that very powerful forces benefited from these murders, and we peeled back the layers of that murder to analyze the Marcos dictatorship, forces in the Union, the United States government, as well as the heads of the canneries who all would benefit from the murders of Silme and Gene. And when you talk about a campaign that lasted, well, that lasts even up until today, but it took us until 1991 to finish the Philippine side of that and the corrupt forces within the Union. And we did it with the broadest support. We did it with a multi-strategy of building support in the anti-imperialist movement, in Congress, in the Filipino community, within media, major media campaign, and a campaign that stretched all the way to the Philippines. And we persisted even after the organization fell apart. But we didn't do it alone, and we could have never done it alone. We could have never gotten to the bottom of this case, and we couldn't have won a landmark decision of $23.5 million for the families of Silme and Gene, a landmark decision that is unmatched to this day. Now, obviously, we didn't get all that money, but we got the decision, and that case is used in other legal cases around the world of holding. It's the only time that a foreign dictator has been held liable in the United States for murders of US citizens. Today, we rise again. We were just at the doorsteps of the FBI on Thursday. We had a front page story about reopening the case around the US participation in these murders. 37 years later, we're still at it. And we won't let go, and we won't rest until we have uncovered all of those responsible for Silme and Gene's murders.
So welcome everyone, and thank you for coming to what we think is a very historical moment. Our book, A Time to Rise, has taken over 20 years to finish, and so we're very happy to finally have this Seattle book launch. Many of you have known about our efforts to finish this book, and there are a few of the people here that have contributed, were contributing authors to the book, but there are many more in the audience who wrote stories. Maybe you could have a show of hands of those that wrote stories in the book. There's Velma, Emily, Chris Melro, Mike Withy, Terry Mast. Yes. So there were a number of people in Seattle that contributed stories. There were a number of people in Seattle who didn't quite finish their stories. And so maybe one day they'll be published on a website or in volume 2 of KDP book stories, which hopefully wouldn't take another 20 years to finish. But we feel that A Time to Rise, which is the name of our book, is a very important book, especially for this juncture. It's important because we feel that it helps to leave our legacy in writing about the work that we did as an organization. It also helps for young people to learn about the radical movements that came before them and experiences, and to share our lessons that we learned from that work, as well as we think it's another time to rise because of what's happening in the Philippines. And Rene will talk a little bit about that in his presentation. I'm very glad that Rene Cruz, one of the editors of the book, was able to join us, and he's going to speak after me. There were several editors in the course of the 20-some years that took to write this book. I would say there were like 5 or 6 editors, and Rene was important because he's a real writer. He's a real journalist, author, and so he really pushed forth in the final push to get the book done. And so we're glad that he was able to join us. He lives in California. We think that this is an important book as well because oftentimes history of people of color, the history of radical movements are never written by the people who make that history. And so this has been quite an accomplishment of the 30-some people that contributed stories in this book, because we wrote these stories. And many of these stories are very painful stories that took a long time to finish, but there are also many joyful stories of victories that we were able to accomplish in the years that we carried out our work. Oftentimes, it is the white male who gets to tell our history, and we felt it was important to tell our history while we're still alive. So, you know, that's always important to do, right? And so I think for many of you who have been involved in radical movements and progressive movements, it's important for you to write your stories as well and to share them with young people as well as your children. Many of the children of KDP members never even knew our histories, so this was important for them as well. As I said, A Time to Rise was a collective effort of over 20 years. And unfortunately, we just lost 2 of our members of the KDP. Rick Furukawa died, they actually died 2 days apart. Rick Furukawa, who was a founding member of the Seattle chapter, passed away June 3rd, and January 3rd. And Esther Simpson, and her family is here tonight, passed away just 2 days after Rick did from cancer. Esther's story is an important part of this book, as she was a nurse who came to the United States and carried out important work that the KDP did in the healthcare sector. So the stories here, there are many things, human stories that reach into people's personal memories to tell of our struggles in taking up working class struggles and juggling family life, personal commitment, race and gender identity, and some of us were young, like Romy, he's going to read from his story, a youth perspective. Not that Romy's not still young, but he looks young. But what this book is not, is a definitive history of the KDP with all its line struggles and more in-depth stories, ideological developments. So we leave that for another book and for some of us to write. Maybe Rene will write that book. So just a little bit about, because I think there are some people here that don't know who the KDP, or the English name for the KDP was the Union of Democratic Filipinos. And we were founded in 1973 as a radical organization committed to social change. And we were an unusual group because we were made up of both Filipino-Americans, Filipino immigrants, some Filipino immigrants and nationals who came to this country out of exile because of the US Marcos dictatorship. We had a dual program of supporting the National Democratic Revolution in the Philippines, and the most immediate strategy we had for that work was to overthrow and to end the US Marcos dictatorship and to end the US support of that dictatorship, which was finally done in 1986 as a result of people's power. The second part of our work was a socialist program in the United States, organizing in the Filipino community. The Filipino community today is the second largest immigrant community in the country, next to the Chinese Americans. But it's still a very small community, so it is unusual that a radical organization like the KDP formed and was able to, we think, accomplish a lot of political work and organizing that won concrete victories. As part of that socialist program, we carried out many democratic rights struggles, including leading in the international hotel struggle to save housing in San Francisco. We fought for the rights of nurses and doctors who immigrated to this country for fair licensure. We also did youth organizing. We actually organized youth here in the International District to take up the Philippine struggle, as well as to fight for youth rights. And so we existed actually until about 1986, but continued to have a newspaper until 1990, in which Rene was the editor of the newspaper. So for those years, we had chapters in all of the major cities that there were Filipino communities. There were about 10 chapters. Hawaii, we actually had a chapter in Guam at one point. Seattle, San Francisco, Oakland, LA, San Diego, Chicago, New York, Washington, DC. And we also had the International Association of Filipino Patriots in Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver. So we were not, though, in terms of numbers, very large organization, although I'm sure the FBI and the CIA thought we were in the thousands. But I don't think we were really over 250 people. And so, but as I said, we were at every major front and struggle that was, that confronted the Filipino community. The Seattle chapter was the most unusual chapter and the largest chapter, numbering in probably about 35 or 36 members. But it was a multiracial chapter. It was actually started by Dale Borgeson, a man of Swedish descent, who was sent by the KDP National to organize the Seattle chapter. And he found Silme Domingo and Angel Doniego at the University of Washington. Took him a long time to tackle those guys and form the KDP chapter. David Della, myself were founding members, and Sherry Wu, who's in the back, and Elaine Coe, who runs this place, was also a founding member. But there was Dale Borgeson, who founded the chapter, Japanese Americans, Chinese Americans, multiracial folks, and so many of the other Asians parading as if they were Filipinos.
Wannabes.
All right. Andy Mizuki, we used to call him Andy Santos. And oftentimes they were tasked to sell the Angka Tupunan, our newspaper, and to organize as well in the Filipino community. But one of the major strongholds of our work was here in the International District, as we fought to save this area as a neighborhood for the Asian community. Today that fight continues as gentrification and continues to develop in the International District.
That section is called The Test of Fire, and there are other stories written. Alonzo Sasson, who was part of the Local 37 team, wrote a very personal story about his recollections of Gene Viernes. And then Dale Borgeson wrote a story called The Terrible Blow, which is also a personal story of how he met Silme Domingo and the work that he did. Emily Van Bronckhorst, who's here today, wrote Initiation from Hell, which is how she got recruited into the Alaska Cannery Workers work in Local 37.
as well as Terry Mast, who wrote a story, "We Had Already Lost Too Much to Turn Back," the struggle to take complete control of the Union after Silme and Gene were assassinated. And then Mike Withy has a story called "A Night in Camelot" about when we went to the Philippines after the overthrow of the Marcos regime to get justice for Silme and to get the cooperation of the Philippine government. And one of my favorite stories, "A Memory of Strong Women," which was written by Lillian Galedo, about when she was asked to transfer to Seattle from the Bay Area to help bolster the work here in the Committee for Justice and the KDP chapter. And I also have a story called "Long Road to Justice," which spans the whole decade that we were struggling for justice. And lastly, our friend Jim Douglas, who passed away last year, wrote a story called "Defeating the Marcoses in a Court of Law." So it's probably one of the most comprehensive, the first comprehensive writings about the murders. And it was begun at a retreat that we all went to in Whidbey Island. The Key family has a cabin there, and we went there to write our stories. And it was very difficult. It was the first time, and it was several years after the murder.